Right, welcome back everyone for our final lecture, Mass Graves and Ethics. John.
Right, pretty much all the images you're going to see are not pleasant. So rather than me tell you in front of each one, if you don't want to see them, just keep your eyes shut all the way through. I notice some of you have already, so it's not an innovation. I can see all sorts from here. Mass graves and ethics. In the 1990s, when forensic archaeology was starting to take off as a field discipline, and found itself faced with the excavation of modern mass graves, it became all rather alarming. This was new territory, modern murder on a large scale, ethnic cleansing, political influence, and military action. Of course, archaeologists had seen this all before, but in more ancient times. Conflicts didn't seem to matter when there were old conflicts. In fact, they were quite intriguing. Archaeologists generally were comfortable with poking their noses into places where the battle dust had long since settled, where populations were anonymous and the whole thing was in the deep past. They could occupy themselves in an inherited landscape thick with castles, fortifications, ramparts, defences, artifacts rich with weaponry, and a later history defined by warring monarchs and battles. So no wonder archaeologists have the opportunity to theorize on someone else's conflict, past conflict, in a very detached way without being blown up, shot at, or feeling sentimental, or without any whiff of death or misery. But the archaeology of mass graves was different. It was real. The bodies archaeologists had to dig up had names, they had grieving families, and they stank. The judiciary were looking over their shoulders while they did it. Armed soldiers stood behind them with Kalashnikovs, and the world's press showed an interest which lessened over time because archaeology is such a slow, boring process to watch. To the archaeologists, it suddenly hit home that what they were doing actually mattered. That was the frightening part. It wasn't about staring wistfully at the ground, considering options and engaging in intellectual discussion with colleagues or giving lectures at conferences or writing learned papers. They were commissioned, among other things, to help produce evidence that will lead to the conviction of war criminals on an international court, ensure positive identity of victims, and help support closure for grieving families through repatriation of bodies. And this was one big step from excavating a medieval cemetery of nameless peasants whose relatives and friends had long since joined them in the ground, and whose demise was only of interest to readers of specialist journals. Forensic archaeology was a new subject, still finding its feet, and without much in the way of credibility in the arena it found itself operating in. So it needed to galvanize itself, sort itself out, and show it could come up with the goods. Now, archaeologists are by nature tidy people, a characteristic needed to ensure logical methodologies in discovery, recording, and analysis. They have a history of wanting to put things in boxes, both physically and metaphorically. And one only has to revisit some of the older works written on artifacts, and by older I mean up to the 1980s, to see how archaeologists obsessively reduced every single artifact type to a series of letters and numbers in order to organize them into groups and categories, each with subdivisions and subgroups expressed in a variety of Roman and Arabic numerals and letters, liberally interspersed with parentheses and colons. Studies of students of prehistoric pottery, Bronze Age daggers, or Anglo-Saxon spearheads will know exactly what I mean. Now, I mention this fixation for putting things in categories not to ridicule the evolution of archaeological research, or for that matter my erstwhile colleagues, because I've been a great categorist myself, but to give some background. And it may come as no surprise to learn that one of the early issues in excavating mass graves was one of definition. And for the definition to apply, the victims had to be buried collectively and probably simultaneously. And so the definition would exclude, for example, victims buried in the West Garden and cellar in Cromwell Street, Gloucester, where, as far as we know from Sir Bernard Knight's sondages, they were buried as individuals. The problem relates to the number of people needed to be buried for the grave to be referred to as a mass grave, a topic that provided a fairly exhaustive subject for discussion in the early years of mass grave investigation. The definition also had to take into account that there were different types of mass grave that all had become bundled under the same umbrella. Now, as far as numbers were concerned, clearly it required more than one person to be buried, after which it becomes a matter of debate. Some argue that a grave containing only 2 persons could hardly be described as mass, in the same way as a hoard with 2 coins could not really be described as a hoard, and I have some sympathy with that. Even 3 was too few, others argued. A fairly arbitrary line seems to have been eventually drawn at 6. Not, of course, that it mattered to the victims, but it did seem to matter to the archaeologists and the anthropologists. However, this still left some uncertainty as to how to describe graves containing 4 or 5 people, but here the term multiple emerged as being a useful one. It was a much more versatile word than mass. It had less of the perceived stigma and could be used more ubiquitously. Mass, others thought, had strong connotations of genocide, whereas multiple was more an expression of quantity than the necessarily implying any malevolence. And this is where issues of definition began to rear its head. Someone rightly pointed out that in major disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes, where victims needed to be buried in a hurry, often without identification in order to prevent disease, the term mass grave was also being used. The difference here, of course, was that the burial was likely to have been of a more humanitarian nature. The victims may have been in numbered body bags. They were usually arranged neatly in rows with a plan, albeit a crude plan, of which numbered body was where. And there may have been a cursory service of respect as the burial took place. And that, of course, is a far cry from the cynical dumping of bodies and body parts using machines that resulted from ethnic cleansing and genocide. Yet the term mass grave was applied to all of them. It applied too to those killed in battle, and here I think of the graves from the English Civil War, where bodies from both sides were buried in pits in post-battle tidying up operations. Now, should we call these mass graves or war graves, the latter again having a greater connotation of dignity or possibly even justification? And what about this interesting example that came to light recently in Spain, where archaeologists recovered the remains of some 500 soldiers buried during the siege of Barcelona in the mid-17th century. They exhibited no wounds and appeared to have been buried very quickly and without order. Analysis suggested they died from salmonella poisoning. And what about the resting place of the 6 Australian soldiers that we were tasked to find in northern France? They fell in the First World War and were buried together with a short service of remembrance in a convenient bomb crater, now levelled over as part of the arable landscape you can see here. So a war grave is a socially respectable term to commemorate those who fell in battle. But most mass graves contain civilians, not soldiers, and I suppose the term should be a reflection of the cruelty of the perpetrators, not an epithet for those who lie in them. And I mention all this not to be pedantic or confusing, although I'm sure you'll think I've been both, but to point out that the term mass burial is being used to cover a multitude of different scenarios, and therefore that the archaeological interrogation of one mass grave may need to be completely different from the archaeological interpretation of another, depending on circumstances, purpose, and on the answers required. And the way you skin a cat actually matters. You will I hope, see what I'm getting towards shortly. Now, the whole issue of mass graves, as it were, posed new challenges for everyone. Archaeologists, anthropologists, politicians, and NGOs, non-governmental organisations. And this chart, produced by Professor Kath Slater from the University of Ulster, looks at the likely numbers of victims in mass graves from South America alone. Never mind the Balkans, never mind South Africa, or never mind Eastern Europe. The task is a mammoth one. Now, excavating a body from a grave is relatively simple. Given that much of what we know about past societies is based on the excavation of human remains, most archaeologists are quite conversant with skeletal components and in which bits belong where in the human anatomy. But this challenge is different, not only in terms of sheer numbers of bodies, but because the remains are not always skeletal. In fact, they are rarely skeletal. And the victims could be in a variety of different states of decay, as we saw earlier. Worse, in some instances, as we shall see in a few minutes, some of the victims, because of the compression involved and the movement of bodies, have become entangled or disarticulated. And this was seen at its most severe in the Balkan conflict, where many individuals lost their anatomical integrity, not just within a grave, but between graves, as a result of the clandestine movement of bodies that had already been buried once. Now, this movement took place on an industrial scale from one mass grave to another in order to elude detection. Some of the graves could be little different from a medieval charnel pit in necessitating the establishment of what were known as reassociation centres set up by the International Commission for Missing Persons, the ICMP, who were organising in the Balkans the recovery where skeletal elements of specific individuals from different locations could be reassociated using a massive DNA program. And at the time I was there was something in the order of 4,000 unclaimed, unidentified bodies stored in this chilled warehouse in Tuzla, eastern Bosnia, in racks 6 deep. Much of the reassociation of body parts in both the graves and in the centres were carried out by those who were adept at recognising skeletal components, namely the forensic anthropologists. Now, a note briefly on the definition of the word anthropology here. In the United States, anthropologists are those who deal with hard human tissue. The terms biological anthropologist or physical anthropologist are used as well, and hair splitting apart are the same thing, although people were bound to tell me they're not. The problem is that archaeology per se does not exist in the United States other than as a subset of anthropology, and in a very demeaned form when compared to its UK counterpart, which is a field discipline in its own right. And at risk of offending US anthropological colleagues even further, their understanding of archaeology sometimes focuses around sieving, screening as it is called, with a total underestimation of the complex stratigraphic problems that UK archaeologists have to contend with. And not surprisingly, tensions can arise when the two parties, archaeologists and anthropologists, are required to work together in the same mass grave. A tension exacerbated by the presence of the medically trained forensic pathologist, who probably sees no point in having either of them there. Normal practice, however, tends to be as follows. The archaeologist is responsible for the recovery of each body, but with a good understanding of skeletal anatomy in order to do it. The anthropologist is responsible for maintaining the integrity and record of the human remains, but with a good understanding of archaeological method in the process. Inevitably, practitioners in one field find it hard to believe that someone in the other discipline can even be half competent in their own. Now, I think it's fair to say that in mass grave work, the relationship between archaeologists, anthropologists, and indeed between both of them and the forensic pathologist could sometimes be prickly. Now, archaeologists are adaptable people. They have to be, given that no two sites are ever the same, and that each site presents its own idiosyncratic problems. Mass graves are no exception. Taken as a group, they pose little of a generic problem other than of size. One issue, for example, as shown here, is the occasional preference to excavate the grave by leaving it on a plinth on the left, working around it from the outside, as opposed to the more traditional method of taking the grave down from the inside, which is on the right. It would be wrong to say that excavating mass graves requires extraordinary techniques or special methods to be successful, merely techniques and methods that have been adapted from the norm and which any proficient archaeologist would have implemented anyway. The insistence on having SOPs, dedicated SOPs, standard operating procedures, by the employing NGOs is not so much an issue of the archaeologist having to meet new challenges and wrestle with issues of methodology, but of the NGO having to define what it does for the purpose of back covering and quality assurance, and in the process providing archaeology with a straitjacket which can conflict with the versatility and flexibility that makes archaeology what it is. Now, of course, the mechanics of excavation are one thing and are relatively easy to be resolved. Archaeologists are by nature experienced and good at flying by the seats of their pants when they need to. What they may not have reckoned with, however, are matters of conscience. And I want to take as an example from here on the Bosnian conflict and the massacre in Srebrenica in the 1990s. This image of a bridge in Sarajevo with the woman begging shows probably the most significant or notorious historic site anywhere in Europe. It was at the end of this bridge that in 1914 Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated, and his death directly lit the blue touch paper for World War I, indirectly World War II, which followed, and most recently the conflict following the death of President Tito in the former Yugoslavia, of which the Srebrenica massacre was just one element. What happened on this bridge in 1914 in many ways triggered conflicts which directly and indirectly brought about the death of something in the order of 80 to 90 million people, and included between 1992 and 1996 the siege of Sarajevo by the Serbian Red Army forces. And it's a sad reflection of our immunity to disasters and scenes of war-torn cities like Sarajevo that we're no longer appalled as we might be at the reality of war zones only a few hours flying time from the UK. In 1995, at Srebrenica, in the east of Bosnia, some 8,000 Bosnian men and boys of fighting age were rounded up and executed in warehouses by Serbian forces and dumped by machine into mass graves. To excavate each of those graves for the purposes of bringing justice to every one of the 8,000 individuals was, and still is, a judicial non-starter. It would take decades under current resources. More feasible is to focus on the few selected graves where witness accounts and other strong forensic evidence can frame a known military offender to give the greatest chance of containing a conviction. Key person and Radovan Karadzic on the right, who could be directly implicated. It is testimony to the scale of the massacres and to human misery that the evidence for conviction didn't even need to establish the identity of every person buried there. The simple proof that a group of people from one place was summarily executed under orders and their bodies dumped in a grave in another place seemed to have been sufficient. It's disturbing to think that even in this century, as far as the courts are concerned, the victims can still be anonymous, like a bunch of medieval peasants put to the sword by a feudal lord and buried them in a big pit to keep them out of the way. But for the purposes of justice, it matters little who they are, just that they represent a human sample that testifies to the existence of a genocidal event, a war crime on a massive scale. And once a conviction has been obtained, The judicial lid can then be shut, but not the humanitarian one for the thousands of grieving families whose relatives are still to be recovered in the graves that have yet to be excavated. The individuals may still need to be identified, repatriation arranged, and something approaching closure restored. And this is where tensions can arise and where the loose ends still dangle. So we're concerned with the fate of those 7,000 or so victims whose evidential status wasn't forensically useful for conviction purposes and who still remain buried in great heaps even to this day. What happens to those victims when the resources run out? Is there such a thing as a budget or economy excavation, some dumbed-down version that can be geared solely to identification and repatriation? Will the archaeologists be justified in undertaking this, ignoring forensic evidence, ignoring cable ties around wrists, ignoring blindfolds, projectiles, not looking at the soil environment, ignoring tyre tracks, foreign materials, personal possessions, and the spatial distribution of cartridge cases on the surrounding surface, for the simple reason that different questions are being posed, different questions being non-forensic questions? Because most archaeologists make a point of recording everything they come across. They see it as their duty, that they have some ethical responsibility to record what is being destroyed, and they have to swallow hard not to. Once an excavation is concluded, there's no going back to check on something or to try it a different way. It begs the question, can you answer queries from excavated data to questions that weren't posed when the excavation strategy was devised? And more specifically, if you design an excavation strategy based on humanitarian repatriation, can you still answer questions afterwards which have forensic veracity and vice versa? One thing that excavating mass graves emphasizes is the inevitable tension between humanitarian logistics, prosecutional logistics, and scientific logistics, and the fact that the archaeologist only has one single bite at the cherry. Now, all the excavation scenarios that I've discussed in the last 5 sessions have made a simple assumption, namely that the archaeologist is in charge, that he or she can have a realistic time frame in which to work and a major role in decision making. When this is not the case, perhaps when working under foreign governments with different political demands and judicial processes, or with NGOs with specific agendas, personal and professional ethics can become severely mangled. Here are 4 scenarios, all of which are real. A. The archaeologist is given carte blanche to undertake the excavation to his or her higher standards and make a full recovery and record of all the victims with all associated evidence for both forensic and humanitarian purpose. This is the ideal. B. The archaeologist is allowed to help lift bodies out of the ground, but has no say whatsoever in their method of recovery or in the collection of any associated evidence. C. The archaeologist is permitted to stand outside the tapes and observe machines digging out disarticulated corpses by the bucket load while soldiers drag the pieces into body bags. And finally, D. The archaeologist is sent to support a local community and watches as desperate local men and women dig frantically with spades and shovels to find their loved ones. Where is the moral high ground in all of this? Now, in the last 3 of these, where archaeologists have little or no say in the proceedings and can identify manifest flaws in what's happening, what do? Do they raise their noses in the air, mumble something about professional purism and walk out, decline the role? Or maybe they swallow hard, accept their lot, make sure that the events and their shortcomings are recorded in full. This, after all, will constitute the history of the region in times to come. Would walking out be professionally justified? Would it be an abrogation of moral duty? Are there minimum standards that can be devised and waved aloft? we can certainly produce them. Simple minimum standards on fixing the location of the site, on a written strategy, on excavation method, on recovery, on recording and archiving. But that doesn't mean to say that the minimum standards will be recognised internationally, never mind by the man standing there with a gun. And in the last of these, D, among the distraught community, does the archaeologist join in and do what he or she can to make the exercise vaguely creditable? And do you think the people they're trying to help are interested in minimum standards either? So does the archaeologist stand back in full knowledge that the body taken by a family on the basis of presumptive clothing is almost certainly the wrong one? And in the very first scenario, A, where the archaeologist is pretty much in charge, the ideal situation, do they pursue the goal of convicting the military general or warlord who ordered the massacre, knowing full well that he'll be executed if found guilty using the evidence that he or she has helped to provide? If the archaeologist in question is opposed to capital punishment, how do they balance, on the one hand, obtaining justice for the victims, with the knowledge that, on the other, to do so, they may bring about a person's judicial death? And the more you think about it, and the more you look at these options, the more you realise how much simpler it is to stick to excavating medieval pits. Now, most criminals who wish to dispose of their victims do so in a manner that they anticipate will elude detection in their lifetime at least. Disposing of a single individual, especially a child, poses a relatively small problem in comparison to the burial of scores of people. Disguising a grave containing one person is very different from disguising a grave containing over 100. It's more than just a matter of the size of the hole, nor can it be achieved quietly or under the cover of darkness. The operation requires earth-moving machinery, noise, transport, activities which are visible from both the ground and from the air. It leaves a large scar on the landscape, which is highly vulnerable to vegetation change and large enough to be visible from satellite imagery. Even a relatively small-scale grave, such as this in Iraq, will exhibit a vegetational difference even over a small timescale. Now, along the banks of the river Drina in eastern Bosnia, the river that divides Serbia on the east and Bosnia on the west, are a string of mass graves along the narrow Kanchari road. The position of each grave can be modelled predictively on the basis of vegetational characteristics, size of disturbance, and distance from the road. Almost without exception, each one is booby-trapped with explosives by the perpetrators as a final deterrent to those like us who might wish to recover the bodies. There is some merit in thinking that many mass graves were never intended to be clandestine. On the contrary, they may have been deliberately located to ensure that local communities knew exactly where they were, either as a reminder to the living to keep in line or to prevent resettlement of cleansed areas. The Kanchari Road runs through a very beautiful part of the landscape. The route winds through hay meadows on the left, with the scars of graves still visible where the land falls away at a distance from the road on the right. Identifying graves developed into a relatively simple process, put into a hierarchical procedure triangle here, which the ICMP used. This demonstrates the methodology, which starts with satellite reconnaissance, identifying vegetational change, followed by geophysics, and then spot location, and finally the excavation itself. Now, a brief word about geophysics, which I have criticised heavily earlier. Here I have to concede it came into its own. Given the size of the footprint it was looking for, it works particularly well. I'm not going to talk about the use of ground-penetrating radar, although that was used, but the application of electrical resistivity. Here it was used in one of the predicted grave locations. The outline of the grave could be identified. That's the blue outline A on this 20 by 20 metre survey grid. A blue rectangle, typical of mass grave size in the area, with a width roughly the size of a mechanical excavator bucket. This blue marks an area of low resistance to an electrical current and likely disturbance, whereas the red marks an area of high resistance, B, probably compressed ground commensurate with the continued movement of a large vehicle. Having identified the general outline of A, we then took a series of pseudo-sections across the target, across both axes, to produce a three-dimensional model of the grave, much like electrical tomography used medically, but cruder. We now know the grave dimensions, shape, and depth. We can see from its shape it has a ramp leading into it. The overall size and configuration gives us some idea of the number of individuals likely to be present. And with that knowledge, it's a short hop to interpreting how many archaeologists, how many anthropologists, pathologists, mortuary technicians will be needed, how long it will take, what facilities will be required, and the security implications, in other words, a management plan. But better still, as archaeologists, and given our need to work from the non-invasive to the invasive, we have the information we need for a head start. Any individual criminal grave, like the ones we see regularly on midsummer murders, is unlikely to have involved more than one or two perpetrators directly responsible for the murder and burial. Conversely, in a mass grave engineered by military or paramilitary groups or by a political faction, there is inevitably a line of command which obscures the guilty party or is argued to dissipate the guilt. Who holds responsibility in this horrific image of summary execution? The general who ordered it, the commander who passed it down the line, the soldier spraying the bullets into the victims, the man holding the cartridge belt to facilitate it, and everyone else who let it happen, including the photographer. Without a specific individual to finger, they can all accuse each other up and down the chain. And as a result, the need to cover up the crime ceases to be of overriding importance. It can always be blamed on somebody else. Equally, hiding the site becomes less of a priority, and in any event, eyewitnesses can often pinpoint the site on the ground. There are no two ways about excavating mass graves. It's unpleasant, but it's also challenging, and my memories are not fond ones, and the length of time I worked there pales into insignificance compared to many others who made it their livelihood. It was another culture, both in the grave and out of it, and I'm going to run you through a typical day. It takes the archaeologists about 45 minutes to drive from their flat to reach the site, located in a military establishment. It was presumably thought to be a secure location to hold a grave. And now, after all the political rapprochement, the authorities had reluctantly made it available for excavation. At the gatehouse, the car gets stopped by a security guard wielding a semi-automatic. He's young and wears a peaked military hat that's far too big and has neither the capacity to speak English nor to smile. His uniform is threadbare and has seen better times, but he gathers in everybody's passport with authority, checks the photographs, staring at each one of us in turn. Once inside, the car drives through the lines of armoured vehicles and around a corner, away from the buildings, into a landscaped area, surrounded on three sides by earthen berms and piles of rubbish on the other. This was used as a firing range. Enclosed inside it are a series of khaki tents, with occasional figures clad in white emerging and disappearing between one tent and another. The largest tent, about 30 metres long, conceals a grave containing over 200 bodies. There are about 30 or 40 still left to be excavated, and so the working day continues. This is a secondary grave. Its victims have been executed in derelict warehouses some 150 kilometres away. The bodies lifted by machine into open trucks and driven into woodland where machine graves had already been prepared. Eyewitnesses who hid in the forest later recount in court how one by one the trucks arrived in the dark and tipped their loads, and how mechanical excavators covered up the bodies with earth and spread the excess soil around. This overall disturbance had been a giveaway footprint to US spy planes, later necessitating the hasty removal of bodies to new sites to avoid any further detection. They were dug up again by machines, bodies, clothing and soil, then dispatched once again to trucks and transported for reinterment into a secondary grave where supposedly they might escape detection altogether. This is one such secondary grave. Unsurprisingly, in the process of reburial and in the heat of midsummer, many of these victims had become disarticulated. Hands, feet, or limbs had become detached, commingled with other remains, or flattened under the movement of the excavator tracks. Differential decay from body stacking, movement, and compression was rife. But this was more than just the site of a secondary grave. This turned out to be a processing plant for human remains, a place where the distorted bodies of men and boys could be extricated from a large rectangular scar in the ground, numbered, stripped of clothes, stored, autopsied, sampled from DNA, bagged, and then put into storage to await domestic repatriation. Those visible at the far end of the grave are mostly skeletalized. This reflects the buried environment of their primary grave from which they were collected. Those next to them originate from a different primary grave where hatred was not simply limited to execution. The corpses then had petrol thrown on them, then ignited, hence the burning. Those in the middle had also been excavated, but had come from a third primary grave, their fleshy, saponified state leaching, as you can see, into the sides of the grave walls. The recovery doesn't take place, as you might hope, in some sanitized amenity with bright tiled walls, scrubbed floors, and shiny equipment maintained to modern standards of clinical excellence. The work surfaces are provided by trestle tables, and the field generator operates the lighting, and the tent sides flap in and out when it's windy. There are walk boards which offer some stability against slipping on the scattered human effluent that's accumulated on the earthen floor. Believe it or not, this is a place near a European provincial capital city, but provision of facilities and provision of cooperation was both somewhat limited. During the night, the smell becomes concentrated in the tent, and it slides out with a through draft as the morning air through the ventilator shafts. It's about 3 meters wide, the grave, roughly the width of a huge mechanical ditching bucket needed to create it. It's been excavated down by archaeologists by hand and is now almost 2 meters deep, with the original vehicle ramp exposed at one end. The bodies that are left are clearly visible as individuals. Some are contorted and wrapped round each other, some body parts line pieces along the vehicle tracks at the bottom. There is a solitary fleshed head, flattened like a plate, where a truck had continually run over and over it as it dumped its human loads. A photographer is brought in. He stands at a fixed point at one end, the same position where he always stands for his daily photographs. He does the same each morning and each evening before work starts and after it's finished. There are no guards on the site overnight. This photographic continuity is the only evidence that the grave has not been tampered with during the hours of darkness. The archaeologists each collect a set of whites from a box, the entrance, and wear a new one each day. These are rarely the right size and always uncomfortable, but they introduce a degree of immunity from the hazards of the grave and give the archaeologist some sense of corporate identity, rather like a school uniform. I think the horror is not so much in the mass death, but in the enormity of social hatred that causes it, hopelessly mismatched by the small number of people and resources allocated to sort it out. The political problems have been resolved, albeit superficially. A line has been drawn under the conflict. there's been a new start, new boundaries drawn on the European map, and gushing speeches made by politicians on all sides. Meanwhile, this humanitarian mess has to be cleared up. It's difficult to see how many victims are left to be recovered. Probably about 40 from the 200 or so that have been crammed between the steep grave walls. However, whoever commanded this concealment clearly had some knowledge of the local soils and the geology. The sandy clays and the silts that had been laid down on the river floodplain had been accumulating over the centuries. They're thick and they're greasy, easy to dig into, as you can see, using a mechanical excavator. Those sheer sculptured sides show the teeth marks of a steel excavator bucket that are still crisp. Now, the tangle of bodies is approached strategically rather than with gusto. Each individual has to be exposed and removed separately. It becomes a matter of working out which one can best be untangled with a minimum of damage to the others. Apart from one, they're all clothed. The exception is an individual, seemingly bent double, with naked back and buttocks showing. Some are given temporary names for ease of recognition, not to personalize them, but to identify their physical integrity during the process of untangling. An arm with an upturned palm emerges from under another body higher up, hopelessly fractured and distorted. Other hands and other feet belong to other people. It's anyone's guess who. And there seems to be a woman crammed head first into the body mass. Her legs are in the air, one straight, one bent, as though riding a bicycle upside down. She is only visible from the waist upwards. She has a bedraggled skirt caked rigid, thick with sand and effluent. Her upper body is buried among the tangled limbs of others. By rights, she should not have been there. She is a woman in a grave of men and boys. We have a transistor radio that hangs from one of the tent stays, and it gets switched on. It blares out some Central European station with a penchant for Western music interspersed with Slovakian ballads, an odd mixture that somehow seems to match the atmosphere. Some people argue that listening to popular music was an obscene thing to do under the circumstances, but such comments are well-meaning, but naive and made from the comfort of the living room. Music is a welcome distraction, and it makes the work more bearable. What matters is not the fact that these people are dead. We can use them only as artifacts, view them only as artifacts, but that the work of recovering them, identifying them, and finding out how they met their end is carried out as effectively, as efficiently as it can be. Some bodies have to be stood on in order to support plans or folders or buckets, and the ends have to be achieved by calculated and justifiable means. This is no intention of disrespect for the individuals. It's merely an expedient to ensure their rightful repatriation and the necessary conviction of murderers. Excavation starts in this group with one of the more peripheral victims in order to assess how he might be contorted under and around some of the bodies in the central core. But much of his body is buried deep under the others. He'll just have to take his turn while others are lifted first. A number is attached to his sleeve. There are some 7 or 8 individuals in this group, and the hole in the grave wall at the back is where the rats come from. Another individual is on the periphery is tried. This one is more successful, and a well-built male is gradually separated from the morass. He's clothed in rags and without shoes, his body's contorted, but his pockets are checked for papers or other identification, his ears for jewellery and piercings, and his wrists for a watch. Kinetic watches were fashionable in the 1990s. These were watches which recharge by simple movement. Equally simple is the fact that without body movement, the watch will stop, usually within 24 hours. And kinetic watches are photographed and recorded as soon as they're found. They can estimate the time of death or last movement more accurately than any scientific techniques applied by a pathologist. A well-tried archaeological recording system is set up. This is an electronic method located at the head of the grave, which bounces a radar beam off a prism held against the point to be measured. The process is one whereby the position of the main components and joints of the body can be recorded in 3 dimensions, starting with the centre of the skull, then the neck, then the shoulders, arm joints, wrists, centre of pelvis, and so on. There are about 15 points in all on each individual. The computer then joins all the points together to produce stick figures. Hardly high-tech, but it does the job. And it has to be done without moving the body so that it can show how each body is lying and how the mass is composed. It takes several minutes to complete the measurements, then much longer to free the body from the other victims. As you can see here, the infill of the grave is a stratigraphy of human remains. The final record would show there are 4 layers here, representing 4 deposits dumped in from 4 different primary graves, each with its own idiosyncratic soil fill, and each with its own set of taphonomic features of the individuals. And there's a new archaeological challenge here, to trace individual bodies and body parts back to their primary graves and to their site of execution, using the various evidential factors illustrated on this slide. This is not just a matter of academic curiosity. This is a matter of recording history for the future. But for the now, this is about repatriation. The cavalier way in which bodies were moved by machine and buried from site to site mean that body parts become disassociated and can end up in more than one primary grave, more than one secondary grave. The remains of one individual were spread across 3 secondary graves and reassociated by DNA. Each body is photographed, a pro forma filled in, associated items recorded and bagged, and the body made ready for lifting. On a good day, the archaeologist can excavate and record maybe 6 victims, but usually fewer. The bodies are carried off to storage by 2 mortuary assistants, one at each end. On the frequent occasions when only one assistant is available, a wheelbarrow is used and the bag tipped out into the storage tent. When its turn for autopsy comes, it will be brought out by the same mode of transport and deposited on a trestle table. The body will be unzipped, stripped of its clothes and any personal effects. Usually there's very little, occasionally some jewellery or rarely identification papers. Outside the tent, any clothes are hung up on the washing line and hosed down with water. Effluent and bits of human tissue pooled by the walkway underneath. Once rinsed, the clothes will be laid out, photographed together on a flat wooden board, and the body number chalked on. These are cheap clothes of man-made fibres with sometimes bright colours, now dulled by soil and body fluid. Some show obvious signs of bullet holes, people gunned down at close range. But this part is about identification, not about judicial exercises. It's in getting relatives to try and identify shirts, jumpers and trousers, idiosyncratically knitted or patched by loving wives and mothers. DNA will follow in due course, but this is a preliminary identification based purely on presumption. It has its merits, but it fails to take into account that victims may have lent or changed clothes. And outside, wives and mothers will argue over recognition of garments, each convinced that an individual garment belongs to their loved one, each faded, stinking jumper seemingly recognised by 6 different women claiming it as theirs. It seems to matter little whether this is the right jumper, the right boot or the right torn trouser. They just need something that they can take them to the next stage of their journey to closure. Once on the mortuary table, each body is examined by the pathologist. It was unclear what the function of this was or what documentation was made. The examination appeared cursory, presumably intended for generic identification purposes only. Cause of death was of secondary interest, and the fact that they were dead seemed to be adequate. In some cases, it was possible to make interpretations, in others not. Some body bags contained almost complete vital parts surviving in some integrity, thanks mostly to the archaeologists using cling film and plastic bags and cable ties to prevent body parts from becoming disarticulated or limbs detached. This, as I later understood, was contrary to the interests of the hired-in pathologists, who were paid by the body and therefore preferred to view each dislocated limb as a body in its own right. Autopsy over, the femur, upper leg bone, is removed for DNA sampling. In many instances, the body is so badly decomposed that the bone could be pulled out with a few discrete incisions. More savage treatment was required in most, and the mortuary assistants do not appear to be unduly ceremonious. The leg is hacked through and the necessary component chopped out. And at the end of the trestle table is a carefully placed wheelbarrow. The assistant takes the bone and with a large knife strips off the excess flesh and sinew into the barrow in the same way that someone might strip a turkey leg into a casserole dish at Christmas. The unwanted heap of muscle, flesh and skin mounts up, and the barrow is emptied a few times a day when it's full and tipped into a water-filled hollow at the end of the area. The sensitivities of the Human Tissue Act have yet to percolate here. Inevitably, bits spill from the barrow on the journey and become trampled into the ground, and the contents of the ground surface alone would do much to upset ethical purists. But clearly there are no ethical purists there, and none are likely to be admitted. Each body, or what's left of it, is then returned to its bag, with clothes and possessions bags separately inside. Rumour is that they are stacked now in the tunnels of an old mine nearby to keep them cool, in the absence of any purpose-built facility. There they remain until such time as DNA matches can be made with the family of some burnt-out village in the foothills. One weekend, the archaeological team took the 4x4 for a trip up into the hills to the places where these victims came from. They'd lived for generations in the small, dry valleys that fed into the river from eastern Bosnia, a place of narrow. They still used horses, carts, oxen, and innovative mechanical devices, but kept themselves alive despite the absence of any obvious infrastructure. They lived as communities and as families, their lives focused around simple homes and their mosque. The very old and the very young all belong to the same households, and the young and the old each work as they are able for the family, whether in the fields, in the house, fetching, carrying, or in the kitchen. Folk have tilled the land in those places for centuries, and high above them are some Iron Age forts, ruined and overgrown on the hilltops as testimony to the presence of earlier farmers. And little has probably changed since then. Life continued to be about resourcefulness, about using different materials for building, adapting and modifying to suit. There was hardly a monetary economy in the Iron Age, and there's barely one now. Those people ate what they grew, and what was left over they traded on for what they couldn't grow. They were peaceable communities with little awareness of the outside world, and their only sin was simply one of geography in living where they did. Now, the bodies that are being recovered belong to these valleys, but no one lives there anymore. The land has been cleansed. And when the war came, the occupants of the villages and houses were forced to flee, and the houses and the mosques were burnt. Those who chose to stay were herded away to certain death. Those who were caught hiding in the hills were shot and left where they were found. And these are now ghost valleys. Driving through them leaves an uncomfortable feeling. The houses were of dilapidated timber, concrete and brick, blackened with smoke. Their ruins are contrast to the bright green of the hay meadows and the trees around them, where it might otherwise have been rural Sussex on a summer's day. Stopping to study one of these buildings gave archaeology a sharpened dimension. The roofs had caved in on rusting metal, and the floors had become overgrown with nettles. They would soon vanish under accumulated soil, and it gave the archaeology of the past this new form. Here was archaeology in the making. Viewed dispassionately by archaeologists in the future, this would simply be an abandoned settlement and little more. And how many prehistoric structures, roundhouses or medieval foundations, have really knowing or even caring what had happened within them? There would have been no concept of the background to this, what caused it and why. In the same way, we wouldn't know anything about that small boy in session 1 beaten to death, that his new sandals were his pride and joy, that his mother lost all 3 sons. And this is why the archaeological record made today in the excavation of mass graves is so essential to maintain these links between population, settlement, and the landscape. Well, that is probably a sober point at which to stop. What I've tried to do over these 6 sessions is just to show a part of archaeology's multifaceted role in modern society and my personal experience of it using forensic archaeology as a vehicle. It's an archaeology very different from the one I blundered into around 50 years ago, but one of the great benefits of working in the very recent past is that it's a reminder that archaeology, whether in the deep past or the present, is not about things, but steadfastly to do with people. And sadly, we tend to detach ourselves simply because the past, to echo L.P. Hartley's words again, we still see as a foreign country. And working in the near present with the benefits of observable landscape change and the effects of memory makes one realise how much we sanitise and compartmentalise the deeper past without really thinking much about the people, the very individuals whose lives were involved. And nowhere is that more apparent, perhaps, than in their death. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for that very powerful summation and final lecture in the series, introducing us to so many dimensions of forensic archaeology. This is the opportunity for members of the audience as we draw towards the conclusion of our session. This is the opportunity for any questions that members of the audience may have. We've also put out a call for questions over the internet, but little has come in yet. We have a few minutes for this. We will go through various rounding up procedures at the end here, and of course we all have to be out of this building before 5 o'clock when the museum closes tonight. Now, what we won't do is one of the things that's happened in previous years at these question and answer sessions, which is to go round with a microphone to everybody. That's rather difficult with current restrictions. So may I ask anybody who does have a question, please to make sure you project your voices as best you can. So with those few points, may I ask if there are any questions from members of the audience? Graham.
May I ask the question?
Yeah.
You mentioned right at the end there what has been obvious about you've been dealing with the very recent past, and in terms of fellowship, the emphasis on very. But there was one subject I thought might come up, and I didn't detect it. Forgive me if you mentioned it. I did hear it over the course of the weekend, and that was the mass grave, or grave, however you like to look at it, following possibly the worst atrocity in the Second World War, the massacre in Katya Forest. concept of forensic archaeology even existed. I think the solution only came as a result of that. Is that the correct impression?
I'm not familiar with the history of that particular grave, but I know that graves of that period, war graves from that period, have been the subject of detailed archaeological investigation in the last 10, 15 years. Forget everybody else. The best crime author is a person called Fred Vargas. Have you come across Fred Vargas? Because she is a French archaeologist, and Fred Vargas has written some splendid crime novels in which the characters are all quirky, the plots are great, and archaeology does feature in them. But it doesn't feature that much in more recent literature, and I have a lot of head banging on the wall when I read things that clearly aren't right. But if you see me afterwards, I shall make sure I can rectify your reading material.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I would endorse your approval of Fred Vargas. I think it's exceptionally good. I wondered whether you had any engagement with forensic architecture group at the University of London.
Forensic architecture?
Yeah.
No, that's news to me. Well, I'm not sure what forensic architecture would entail.
Well, I'm not a forensic architect, but my understanding of it is that you use architectural techniques to reconstruct what might or might not have happened
Oh, I
in
see.
a different situation.
Yeah.
I mean, like all these things, there are some parallels, but there are also very dramatic differences. But I did think it might have been intellectually interesting for some engagement between them and yourselves.
Yes. No. Do you know where they're based?
Goldsmiths.
Goldsmiths, right. Thank you.
I mean, you can easily find them on the
Yeah.
website.
Thank you.
Okay. And any Robert?
Excuse me. You mentioned, you showed some pictures of Momoa's murderers who, as I understood it, they'd taken photographs of where they'd taken their bodies so that they could go back and revisit the sites. I mean, that's the only reason they could take photographs. And I also seem to vaguely remember that reading that Mr. Christie of Brillianton Place kept all his bodies under the floorboards and quite liked living with them. Is this sort of desire to remain in contact with your victims, is this common among the psychopathical classes? And does it lead into some sort of commemoration? Whereas what you'd expect is to just dump the bodies and then went away again.
I just dig them up, Bob. I couldn't answer that because I'm not a forensic psychologist. But you're right. I think that there is some link between people wishing to be in association with the people that they've murdered. There are various examples I could give you, which I won't broadcast because they're unpleasant. What they did with bodies and where they kept them, so they could keep going back to seeing them again. Yes, there is a link, but I think that's a question you should address to a forensic apologist. But going back to the Moors, the use of marker stones was in the photographs. Was more the photographs than the marker stones. Was a way that Brady had in keeping a record, not really for himself, but for making sure that there was a record and the police couldn't work out it was a record. You see what I mean? He liked to be one up on everybody all the time. It was just one of his little games.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I wonder, while we're waiting, John, if I can ask you, what you've shown is a subdiscipline, arguably a discipline in its own right, coming to maturity, and the scale of its use, the implications of its use, developing substantially over 25, 30 years, that kind of time scale. Over the longer term, do you see it diverging further from archaeology or coming closer together, or really developing, as it were, its own protocols, its own procedures, driven in part by the very extraordinary, to most of us, as it were, conventional archaeologists, the very extraordinary sets of deposits with which it has to deal?
I think well, archaeology, as we all know, is a huge holistic discipline, and it has many strings attached to it. But the parent is the basic archaeology, and in order to produce a forensic archaeologist, in order to be a forensic archaeologist, in order to understand forensic archaeology, needs a long experience background of conventional archaeology and field practice, because it's the field practice, I think, that develops from it. That's the essence of what forensic archaeology is. So when we're looking at evolution, that's the first thing. The second thing, the more cases that forensic archaeologists rack up, and there are only about 15 or so authorised forensic archaeologists in the UK. The more scenes and the more cases they have, as I've tried to show here, the more you realise that things are actually slightly different. They're not, they diverge, the evidence nature diverges, the practice nature diverges from its parent, conventional archaeology, and therefore different experiences are needed. And when it comes to excavating graves, it's important to have a much greater knowledge of anthropology and human anatomy than your bog standard conventional archaeologist. You need an understanding of law, an understanding of crime scene protocols. So what I think we're looking for in the evolution of this is university departments producing archaeologists who have this wide background in field archaeology, anthropology, and criminal investigation. That is happening slowly, but to all intents and purposes, it is still archaeology, but no different to something like aerial archaeology or marine archaeology, where there are different elements to it that make it different from its parent subject.
Thank you. Any other points? Sorry, excuse me a second. What was that? Oh, sorry, here, John, there's one, a couple that have come in over the internet. Have you found yourself interpreting your own excavations on prehistoric sites differently as you developed your expertise in forensic excavations?
I think the answer to that is no, because, well, yes and no. No, because the number of bodies that I've excavated from prehistoric sites have been very few, so I can't compare the two there. Yes is the answer to part of it, because it makes you think much more about contamination than you did normally, particularly when you're sort of wet sieving or when you're looking at layers, you're looking at evidence and trying to work out which part of the stratigraphy things are important or not important. The concept of being much more precise and particularly avoiding contamination, I think that's the essence of what I'd answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, may I ask, is there a historical burial or murder that you would have liked to have investigated, and why that particular case?
Lord Lucan.
Thank you for that. May I call, please, on Dr. Diana Swales from the University of Dundee to perhaps come down and give a vote of thanks to our speaker for this excellent series of Rhind Lectures. Dr. Swales.
Mr. President, fellows, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to commence by saying how honoured I am to have been asked by Simon Gilmore to give the vote of thanks for what I am sure you will agree are 6 excellent presentations delivered by Professor John Hunter in this year's Rhind Lectures. I've been watching the lectures over the last 2 days online. The Society's decision to make this year's Rhind Lectures a hybrid event has enabled me to watch sessions that I was not able to attend physically, and to come today and see the last 2 talks and question and answer session in person. To successfully achieve such a hybrid approach, which has made these sessions a special event for both those present in the auditorium and potentially on the sofa at home, is a vast undertaking, and I therefore would like to say a few words of thanks and appreciation on behalf of myself and the Society to the following people who have made this weekend possible. First, I'd like to thank Professor Ian Ralston, the President of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, for chairing and commencing proceedings with a comprehensive summary of John's multifaceted career. Also from the Society, I would like to thank Andrea Kazuski and Jade Dent, Adela Rakova and Kate Bailey. It has been a privilege to hold this event in the National Museum of Scotland, and sincerest gratitude should be paid to the event staff, and specifically Chris and Grant for their audio-visual expertise. The live streaming, which has been extremely successful and very professional, was made possible by Scott Johnson of Mallard Productions. A notable thank you must be made to AOC Archaeology Limited, who were the sponsors for this event. And of course, I'd like to thank John himself and the audience, both here in the auditorium and at home and online. The lectures have been recorded and they will be available on YouTube. I personally have a vested interest in a weekend of lectures on forensic archaeology, but this may not be an aspect of archaeology that is necessarily familiar to all. However, John has presented the topic in a sensitive and accessible manner appropriate for all of whom may be of interest. The vast array of content covered in the lectures encompassed archaeology from the past and the present. In the words of John himself, by dancing away in time and space, and like a medieval bard weaving tales, he enthralled us with a narrative that included, and this is not a comprehensive list by any means, prehistoric landscapes, marker stones, hoards, grave goods, funerary ceremonies, bog bodies, burials of cardinals, body farms, clandestine burials, not only of human remains but other items buried with the intention of later recovery, exhumations, scattered surface remains, mass graves, cold case searches, fires, the representation of criminals in the media and criminal biometrics, the evolution of archaeology and the archaeologists, and misconceptions of both the conventional and forensic archaeologist, and what our disciplines entail, including the involvement in construction of the planning process, and also forensic investigations. In short, there's a little bit of something for everybody, and effortlessly demonstrated the relationships between the archaeology of the present and the archaeology of the past, with which we are all more familiar. John's lectures not only transcended time, but also space, with references being made to Scottish hoards, landscape surveys and forensic investigations in the UK, murders in Russia, and mass graves in Bosnia. Of particular interest was the insight into logistical and ethical challenges faced by the forensic archaeologist and the commitment made by John to pioneer the integration of archaeology theory and practice into criminal investigation in the UK and overseas. John spoke not only of the high-profile cases covered extensively in the media, but also of those that are less well known but of no less importance. The lectures we have heard over the weekend have clearly demonstrated the varied role of the forensic archaeologist and how landscape survey and excavation positively contribute to search and recovery in criminal investigations. The misconceived perception that archaeologists, including forensic archaeologists, just dig holes, is dismissed, alongside the sometimes held misconception that forensic archaeology is the application of forensic science to answer archaeological questions from the past. forensic archaeology answers questions of the recent past and present, and the lectures have clearly demonstrated both the similarities in conventional and forensic archaeology, but also how they diverge. Not least in the existence of living friends and relatives, and the need to provide evidence that is acceptable and admissible to present in a court of law. Today's lectures commenced with a focus on research involving the recently deceased in forensic taphonomy research facilities or body farms. And the research is undertaken with pig substitute for human remains to understand the processes of decomposition that could contribute to developing new search techniques or the improvement of those that exist already, and estimates of time since death. This was followed by an introduction and reflection of the excavation of mass graves, with a consideration of the challenges and the ethical considerations in humanitarian and criminal investigations. And it brought home the realities of working in these complex environments. My final words are of sincerest gratitude to John for coming this weekend to share his knowledge, experience, and passion. I would also like to extend a wider thank you for what I was going to originally call his contribution to forensic archaeology, but that phrase does not give sufficient credence to his initial pioneering commitment to the discipline and his influence and impact, which will continue for many years to come. I would also like to thank John and his family for their kindness and generosity, and his generosity of knowledge when I first moved from conventional to forensic archaeology and from England to Scotland. I would like to ask you all to join me in a round of applause for Professor John Hunter and the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and all those involved in the delivery of the sessions, including AOC Archaeology Limited and the National Museum of Scotland, for such a successful weekend of Rhind Lectures.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that, which I think sums up our weekend excellently. It remains, fellows and guests, for me to thank you for coming and for coming along to this, our first sessions really since we've taken up meeting as real people again and not simply over Zoom. My last job, again, in adding my thanks to John, is to say that I hope we'll be able to see some of you. Obviously, things that currently are evolving very quickly, but as things stand, our next scheduled lecture will be on November the 8th here, and will be Dr. Candy Hatherley talking about Culduthel, that important Iron Age site with its roundhouses. We've had a little bit about roundhouses this weekend. And of course, the Culduthel volume is now out and published by the Society. So I very much hope that we'll see some of you, at least perhaps all of you again, on November the 8th. In the meantime, thank you for coming and safe home. Bye.